Okay. Make sure I get my right spot here. We're working on a series of lessons called The Law of Moses and the Christian. How does the law of Moses affect Christians? What application do we have to do, or what laws do we have to follow? Which ones do we not have to follow? What was the law of Moses all about? What was that for? And we answered some questions about this last week. We first looked at the fact that when we talk about the law of Moses, we're talking about that covenant that God made with the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai in Horeb through the ministry of Moses. And we looked at the verses last week. Also, that a covenant, we explained that a covenant is a mutual agreement between two or more persons to do or to refrain from doing certain things. It's a compact or a contract, a bargain. And we showed that fact in Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 through 8, where it had been offered, it was accepted, and then the acceptance was communicated back. That's a contract. And that's what a covenant is. It's a contract between parties. If Wendy and I agree to do something and we shake hands on it, well then that's a covenant. It's a contract. God gave a law to the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel accepted the law. It was communicated back to God. Therefore, it's a covenant. They agreed to live under it. God made blessings to them based on them living under it. Okay? And we also saw that the law of Moses included laws, specific laws that were given to Israel. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today. It's called by various other things. It's called the law, the Old Testament, Moses, the letter, the first covenant, the first testament. You'll see it mentioned in a number of different ways. We also noted that there was law before the law of Moses was instituted at Mount Sinai. There have always been laws that God expects people to live under. The law of Moses was given to a specific nation, much like the Constitution was given to the United States of America. This was the law for the nation of Israel. Don't lose sight of that. It was not the law for Gentiles. It was the law for the nation of Israel to live under. That's extremely important. But we saw last week that men were charged with sin other than Adam's sin long before Moses' law came into being. Cain was charged with sin, and he didn't eat of the forbidden fruit, and yet he was charged with sin. And there is no sin without law. Therefore, there had to be a law that said, "Thou shalt not murder," long before God said those words to Moses. That had always been on the books. The shedding of innocent blood was always against God's law. And the law of Moses merely codified what was already in place. And as I just said, the law of Moses was a codification of laws that had been given to nations in general. The prohibition of idolatry, murder, sodomy, these were laws that were in effect long before God gave the law to Moses. And remember that when God gives revelation, it's a continuing type of a revelation. It builds upon itself. So when the law was given to Moses, it was given to Moses for that nation. Okay? Let's not lose sight of that. Okay. Now, the law of Moses, which was given to the nation of Israel, contains laws that also pertain to men in general. There are laws that pertain to men in general that are included in the law of Moses. I want you to turn to Romans chapter 1, and we're going to see some of them. Paul lists sins here for which men in general are judged by God. And in Romans chapter 1, beginning at verse 29, he says, "Being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents. Now I'm going to come back to this one in just a second. Okay, I'm going to come back to this one. But look what it says: without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. So you see, men in general know that they're going to answer to God for these things, even though this isn't Moses' law. This is addressed to Gentiles. These specific acts God has always been against. They have always been considered sin. Now, some of them are included in the law of Moses, but this isn't the law of Moses. You see, men in general are under judgment for these things, and that's the point that Paul's making. Now, we have in the room almost as many children as we have adults. And so I want to go back to this disobedient to parents thing. Children, being disobedient to parents is a sin just like murder and debate and deceit, just like all the rest of these. That's how serious it is in God's mind when children are disobedient to their parents. Over in Ephesians it says, honor thy father and thy mother. That means parents plural, not parents singular. You don't just obey one of them and not the other. You have to obey them both. Now, let me address this to the couple sitting here in the front that do not have children yet. One of the things that I really feel good about was that by the time Wendy and I had children, we were already converted. So our boys will never have to unlearn bad habits relative to the way the church is concerned. They were raised in the truth. So I'm going to give you some information so that when your little bambinos come into the world, you already know. The other parents in the room already know this. It's a refresher for them, but this is incredibly important for you, okay? If someone is required by God, which they are, to be obedient to both husband and wife, can you see how incredibly important it is that the two of you are on the same page? If you don't have an agreement as to what that level is, how in the world can how can somebody be obedient to both if you take different positions on what obedience looks like? Don't cause your children to sin by being obedient to one and not to the other. Make sure that you have these conversations ahead of time and arrive at a level that's agreeable, so that now some things obviously you know that you're not to do. If it's a sin in the book, you're obviously breaking the law, but there's so many other things that parents deal with that have nothing to do with sin. It has to do with other things. Make sure that you've come to an agreement ahead of time. And don't put your children in a position where they end up sinning against one and sinning before God because you're inconsistent in your parenting. Okay? It's incredibly important. The children, remember, obey your parents. It'll give you a long life. That's the promise in the scriptures. You might not want a long life, but it'll give you one anyway. Okay. Anyway, you see all of these laws that God had given to men in general, and they'd been there all along. God never allowed the shedding of innocent blood, even though it wasn't until Moses said, "Thou shalt not kill," in the Ten Commandments that we actually had it codified in Moses' law. That doesn't mean that it started with Moses' law. There was a lot of history before Moses ever came around. Okay? I want you to turn to Psalm 147. Psalm 147, verses 19 and 20, which says, "He showeth his word unto Jacob, his statutes and his judgments unto Israel. He hath not dealt so with any nation, and as for his judgments, they have not known them. Praise ye the Lord." That's important. You see, the law of Moses, which also forbade a lot of those items, was not given to the Gentiles at large. Wasn't sent to them. It doesn't mean that God didn't have law. Remember, you know, I find this incredibly interesting. God had a nation among all of the other nations that he dealt with differently than anyone else. How in the world can you then say that you have to keep the law in order to go to heaven, which so many churches, what about those people? What about a time frame for 1,500 years where the only people that had the law were the Jews? And no Gentile had the law. And yet you have to keep the law to go to heaven? There's no Gentiles in heaven from the big institution of Moses' law until the time of Christ? That's incredibly ridiculous. But he didn't give these laws to Gentiles, but some of them were laws that he still judged people over. Okay? So make sure that you understand that there's a general law and there is Moses' law. Some of the laws are consistent and some of them aren't. Okay? There are some things in Moses' law that just simply aren't applicable to us. Okay? In fact, Moses' law, at this point in time, the nation of Israel to whom this was given passed away in 70 AD. Nation isn't even here anymore. So how in the world would we be under a law that for a nation that doesn't exist? Now, turn to Leviticus chapter 18. I want to show you that God does in fact judge Gentiles for things in laws many of which were codified in Moses' law, but he's always judged them on this. Leviticus chapter 18, we're not going to read the entire chapter. I suggest you read it when you get home. But for the sake of time, we'll just look at a few verses. First, we'll begin with verses 1 through 5. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, I am the Lord your God. After the doings of the land of Egypt wherein ye dwelt, shall ye not do. And after the doings of the land of Canaan, whither I bring you, shall ye not do, neither shall ye walk in their ordinances. Ye shall do my judgments, and keep mine ordinances to walk therein. I am the Lord your God. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. I am the Lord. Then he begins to go through a long list of sexual rules, okay? Forbidding things like sodomy and incest and bestiality and a whole bunch of other stuff. And when he gets down to verse 24, he says this, Defile not ye yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you. And the land is defiled. Therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomiteth out her inhabitants. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger that sojourneth among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled, that the land spew not you out also when you defile it, as it spewed out the nations that were before you. For whosoever shall commit any of these abominations, even the souls that commit them, shall be cut off from among their people. Therefore shall ye keep mine ordinance, that ye commit not any of these abominable customs which were committed before you, and that ye defile not yourselves therein. I am the Lord your God. The reason that God gave the children of Israel the land of Canaan and punished the Canaanites were because of the very sins that are listed in Leviticus chapter 18. That's what it says. But they weren't under Moses' law. But their men in general are judged by God's law, whether it contained in Moses' law or not. And these sins have always been an abomination before God, long before Moses' law was given. So God threw them out of the land and told the Jews, don't you do what they did or you'll get thrown out of the land. Okay? Look at Deuteronomy chapter 18. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 through 12. When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. Now these are the things that he's judging the people in that land for. Okay? And remember, without sin, or without law, there's no transgression. So there's a law against this. There was already a law against these items that he's now judging the people in Canaan with. And look at verse 12. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord, and because of these abominations, the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee. You see, these were already against God's law, even though they hadn't been codified in Moses' law yet. They were always in God's law. But I want you to notice something else. If you look at these lists of sins, now I know we didn't go through all the sexual sins over in Leviticus, but there's nothing in here about eating pork. You see that? God, you search the Bible. God never judged a Gentile for eating pork. The dietary rules that we find that the Jews were under, God never judged a Gentile for that. Those dietary rules were only for the Jews. Okay? God never judged a Gentile for not keeping the Sabbath. That was a rule for the Jews. God never judged a Gentile for not being circumcised. Those were rules that were for Jews in the law of Moses, not in the general law. So when it comes to anything that God never judged a Gentile for, they're not obliged to they don't have to keep that part of the law, because it doesn't apply to them. Okay? Leviticus chapter 20. Let me show you this. Leviticus chapter 20. I said it, now let me prove it. Verses 24 through 26. But I have said unto you, ye shall inherit their land, and I will give it unto you to possess it, a land that floweth with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, which have separated you from other people. Ye shall therefore put difference between clean beasts and between unclean fowls and clean. And ye shall not make your souls abominable by beast or by fowl or in any manner of living thing that creepeth on the ground, which I have separated from you as unclean. And ye shall be holy unto me, for I am the Lord, for I the Lord am holy, and have severed you from other people that ye should be mine. Notice, these are specific to these people. These laws are specific. Look at Genesis chapter 17. Verses 9 through 11. Genesis 17, 9. And God said unto Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant therefore, thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. Okay? So we've seen dietary laws, we've seen the law of circumcision. Look at Exodus chapter 31. And then I'll tie this all up together in a minute. Exodus chapter 31, verses 16 and 17. This is the law of the Sabbath. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. There's the law of the Sabbath. Now, I want you to look at Deuteronomy chapter 14. This is a very telling passage. Deuteronomy chapter 14, because this is an excellent example of a law that was binding upon the nation of Israel and yet not on those outside of the nation of Israel. Here's our proof text, okay? Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 21. Ye shall not eat of anything that dieth of itself. Thou shalt give it unto the stranger that is in thy gates, that he may eat it. Okay? You have a cow that falls over dead of natural causes. If you live in Israel, you can't eat it. But you can give it to your neighbor that's not an Israelite, and he can eat it. You see the point? A law that was given to Israel doesn't apply to anybody but Israel. And that's the way Moses' law was. Or thou mayest sell it to an alien. For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not seethe a kid in his mother's milk. So if you have a beast that dies of natural causes, you can't eat it, but you can sell it. Sell it to somebody else and they can eat it. You can give it to somebody that's not a Jew and they can eat it, but Jews can't eat it. You see the point? There are laws that God gave to the nation of Israel that don't apply to anybody else. And if you don't find God punishing someone for breaking the law that's not an Israelite, then that law doesn't apply to them. Does it make sense? In Romans chapter 2, let me try to give you an example of this. Romans chapter 2. Verse 26 says this, Therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? You say, what in the world does that mean? Well, you know what was in the law, right? In the law of Moses, you're required to be circumcised. Well, then how can the uncircumcised, those that are not circumcised, keep the law? How can their uncircumcision keep the law when circumcision is included in the law? You ever wondered about that? That's what this verse is saying, right? Therefore, if this uncircumcision keep the righteousness, how do you keep the righteousness of the law if you're uncircumcised when the law says you have to be circumcised? How do you answer that little conundrum? Well, here we go. Let's think about it. So that's the question. How can an uncircumcised man, in other words, that's another phrase for a Gentile, okay? How can a Gentile keep the righteousness of the law if the law requires circumcision and he's not circumcised? How does he keep it? Well, here's the answer. A Gentile was never required to be circumcised. It didn't apply to them. That part of the law never applied to Gentiles. That only applied to Jews, which were the natural descendants of Abraham. Okay? Circumcision for Gentiles was and is optional. And nowadays, most people that have their children circumcised don't do it for religious reasons anyway. It's usually done for other reasons. But Gentiles were never required by God to be circumcised. And this Gentile is not a member of the nation of Israel. nor is he a natural descendant of Abraham. So let's ask this question. Would I need to be circumcised? Am I Jewish? Do I look Jewish? I had blonde hair and blue eyes when I was a kid. I look more like the Roman Jesus that the Catholics have than the real one. I'm not Jewish. Not only that, I come from, my ancestry comes from Scotland. Okay? Scotland today has a population of roughly about 5.5 million people, I think. And there are less than 6,500 Jews that live in Scotland. So the odds of my having any Jewish blood in me at all are slim and none. That law doesn't apply to me. I'm not Jewish. I don't have to keep a law that was only given to Jews. And God never punished a Gentile for not being circumcised, ever. So it doesn't apply to me. And so I have no responsibility to keep that law because it doesn't apply. Now let me give you another example. In the state of Florida, it's required of attorneys at law that they qualify for and pass the bar exam and get a license to practice law. That's a requirement. That's a law. That is a law in the state of Florida. You have to have a license, and in order to get that license, you've got to pass the bar exam. Okay? So, do I have to have passed the bar and have a license to practice law? Do I? Am I breaking the law because I don't have a law license and never took the bar exam? Am I now guilty? Do I have to stand before the state of Florida and be punished because I never took the bar exam? No, I'm not a lawyer. That law doesn't apply to me, and it doesn't apply to any of you either. You don't have to now run out and take the bar exam in order to satisfy a law that doesn't apply to you. It's the same way with the law of Moses. If it doesn't apply to you, it doesn't apply to you. So that's how a Gentile could keep the righteousness of the law, by keeping that portion that applies to Gentiles and yet not fulfilling those precepts that don't apply to Gentiles. Okay? Make sense? When we look at things dealing with law, there's a couple of things that we have to look at. First off, you got to look at the facts. You have to understand the facts of what we're dealing with. You have to understand the law that we're dealing with, and then you can make a determination whether or not something applies to a specific person or not. So if you consider that the facts reveal a person's state of affairs, and they show whether the law applies to that particular person or not, then you can determine whether or not that person has to keep that law. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's look at this example of the lawyer thing. The law is that an attorney at law must have a license, right? The fact is that Pastor Henderson is not an attorney at law. Okay? So the determination is that I'm not required to have a license, so I'm not breaking any laws, even though the law says lawyers have to have a license. If I were a lawyer, I'd have to have a license, but I'm not, so I don't need one. Okay? If I don't drive a car, I don't have to have a driver's license. Right? And I'm not breaking a law as long as I don't get behind the wheel of a car. Let's look at another example from the law of Moses. The law is that Jews have to abstain from eating pork. Well, I'm really glad I'm not a Jew on this one. I'd be in trouble. No bacon. But that's the law. Jews have to abstain from eating pork. But the fact is, I'm not a Jew. So I can eat pork and not be guilty of breaking the law of Moses because that doesn't apply to me. But I still can't kill anybody because murder does apply to me. Does that make sense? Okay. I think I'm going to let you all out of here early today. Hope you don't have any complaints. I've got one more point that I want to make this morning, and if I start into the next section, we're going to be really long. So I don't want to do that. So I'm going to give you a break. Everybody's complaining? No. Let me give you a gauge of which laws apply to Gentiles and which laws only apply to national Israel. And remember that national Israel ceased to exist in 70 AD when God had Titus destroy the temple and sent the Jews into dispersion, scattered them all over the world. And through studies that we've had before, you know why he did that. Because they were breaking his law. They weren't living by it. So national Israel, that national Israel that was God's program, that was God's church in the Old Testament, ceased to exist towards the end of the first century. So the law of Moses that was for that nation isn't here anymore. But how do we know what portions of the law of Moses we have to keep and what portions we don't? And as I said before last week, remember, none of this has anything to do with your eternal salvation. None of it. Eternal salvation is not based on keeping laws, okay? But it is based on fellowship. So how do I stay in fellowship with God relative to the law of Moses? How do I know what parts I have to keep and what parts I don't have to keep? Okay? If you find God judging Gentiles for something that's forbidden in Moses' law, then that law also applies to Gentiles. All right? Give you the perfect example. Cain. Cain was here long before Abraham. Cain was not a Jew. Cain was judged by God for murder. Murder is in Moses' law. Murder applies to Gentiles as well as Jews, and always has. So when you find where God punishes someone or judges a Gentile based on a specific sin, like the ones that we read about in the New Testament, there's several lists of them that I've gone over before. There's 53 of them in there that God judges you for, and those are written to Gentiles. In those areas, that's what God is going to judge you on. And if it's forbidden in Moses' law, then it's applicable to you. But it's not applicable to you because you live under Moses' law. It's applicable to you because it's always been God's law, and Moses' law simply codified laws that were already on the books. Okay? So that's a case of a law that applies to men in general, also being codified in Moses' law. So when you look through those laws in Moses, and there's 600 and something of them in there, all of that stuff that's in there, if God never judged a Gentile for it, then it's not applicable to Gentiles. Okay? Think about some of them. Do we have to, how many mothers in this room, after they gave birth, sacrificed turtle doves or sheep at the altar? Has anybody? No? It's in Moses' law. So if Moses' law applies to you, you're all in trouble, right? There are so many of these there's a lot more than the 10 Commandments in Moses' law. There's a whole system of laws in there. Ceremonial laws and other laws relative to priests and things like that. That clearly we're not under those, because none of you have taken turtle doves to anywhere to sacrifice them because you had a child. So clearly you recognize that you're not under that portion of it, and neither is anyone else. Jews don't even do that. Of course, there's no temple, but you see the point? There's a lot of this that we never even consider, but then people get hung up on this idea of the law still being in effect, and it's not. Moses' law is not in effect. Moses' law was for the nation of Israel, and don't lose sight of that. But that does not mean that we run free with no laws. There are other laws that are applicable to Gentiles, and that's what we're going to look at next week. We're going to look at the fact that we don't live under that old covenant, we live under the new covenant. The old covenant waxed old and was done away with and was replaced by the new covenant. And that's what we'll get into next week. So with that, let's stand and be dismissed in prayer, and I'll let y'all get to lunch early today.